It did not sound like applause. It did not sound like excitement. It sounded like a door slamming shut on a man's entire life. Millions of television viewers leaned a little closer to their screens without realizing why. Something was wrong. Very wrong. The cameras inside the Soul Train's studio kept rolling, unaware they were about to capture a moment that would outlive every chart-topping song performed on that stage. Los Angeles, 1976. Outside the studio, hundreds of fans screamed Elvis Presley's name through the security barriers, clutching records, faded photographs, and homemade signs. Some had traveled across the country just to catch a glimpse of him. Inside, the atmosphere felt completely different. Bright lights painted the stage in gold. Colored spotlights drifted lazily through the audience. The orchestra quietly tuned their instruments. The audience laughed, talked, and waited for another spectacular television performance. No one noticed the silence behind the curtain, because behind that curtain stood a man who looked like a king, but felt like a stranger. Elvis Presley slowly adjusted the collar of his legendary white rhinestone jumpsuit. The diamonds sewn into the fabric sparkled beneath the dressing room lights, yet they could not hide the exhaustion in his blue eyes. He stared at his reflection for several long seconds. Neither man moved. One reflection belonged to the greatest entertainer in America. The other belonged to a frightened little boy who still remembered the smell of wet wooden floors inside a tiny Mississippi house. He could almost hear his mother's gentle voice. "Keep singing, sweetheart, even when nobody listens." Elvis closed his eyes. He whispered those words back to himself, almost like a prayer. A young production assistant knocked softly. "Mr. Presley, we're live in 3 minutes." Elvis nodded. No answer. The assistant hesitated. Everyone backstage had noticed it. Something about Elvis had changed during the past few weeks. He smiled less. He laughed less. Sometimes he stared into empty space for several minutes without saying a word. Rumors filled newspapers. Some claimed the king was finished. Others insisted a younger generation had already replaced him. Television critics called him yesterday's hero. Music magazines praised new stars while quietly pushing Elvis toward the past. He had read every headline, every insult, every joke. He never answered any of them. Tonight, he intended to answer with music. The assistant opened the curtain just enough for Elvis to see the audience. Every seat was occupied. Actors, musicians, television personalities, record executives. Some admired him. Others had only come to witness his decline. Near the front sat one of America's fastest-rising funk superstars, young, confident, fearless. He wore an expensive crimson suit with a smile that never reached his eyes. He leaned back in his chair, whispering something to the celebrities beside him. They laughed, not with joy, with arrogance. Elvis noticed, then quietly looked away. The stage manager counted with his fingers. 5, 4, 3, 2, 1. The red camera lights switched on. America was watching. The host stepped onto the stage wearing his brightest smile. "Ladies and gentlemen," thunderous applause erupted. "Please welcome a man whose voice has crossed generations." The audience clapped politely. "The one," the orchestra struck its opening chord. "The only," the curtains slowly separated. "Elvis Presley." A wave of white light swallowed the stage. Elvis walked forward with calm, measured steps. For a single breathtaking moment, Everything looked exactly as it should. The audience rose. Camera flashes exploded like tiny stars. Millions of viewers smiled. Then, a chair scraped violently across the floor. The sharp sound sliced through the applause. The young funk superstar stood up. Without asking permission, without warning, he reached over, snatched the microphone directly from the stunned host, and turned toward Elvis. The studio fell quiet. A crooked grin spread across the young man's face. He laughed, not once, again and again. "So," his voice echoed across every television set in America, "the king finally showed up." A few nervous chuckles escaped the audience. He continued, "I thought this stage belonged to the future." Another laugh. "Not yesterday." More people laughed. Someone clapped. Another joined. Within seconds, the laughter rolled through the studio like thunder. Some covered their mouths, others pointed openly. Several musicians lowered their eyes in embarrassment. The cameras instantly zoomed toward Elvis. Every network director knew exactly what audiences wanted. His reaction. Would he lose his temper? Would he fight back? Would he leave? The entire country held its breath. Elvis never moved. He simply looked at the polished wooden floor beneath his boots. His fingers slowly tightened around the microphone still resting at his side. Not from anger, from heartbreak. Because those words were almost identical to words he had heard many years before. Only one other man had ever spoken to him that way. His father. Not as an insult, as a warning. One day they'll cheer louder than anyone. His father's voice echoed somewhere deep inside his memory. And one day they'll laugh even louder. Promise me something, son. Elvis swallowed hard. When that day comes, don't let their laughter become louder than your heart. His breathing became uneven. The audience mistook his silence for weakness. The laughter grew louder. Even the host stood frozen, unable to rescue the moment. The young superstar shook his head with theatrical disappointment. I guess legends don't know when to leave. The audience erupted once more. Then, a voice spoke from somewhere behind the final row. Quiet, fragile, yet somehow impossible to ignore. No. It was barely louder than a whisper, but it carried through the studio like church bells in an empty valley. No. He kept his promise. The laughter stopped almost instantly. Heads turned together. An elderly black man slowly emerged from the shadows at the back of the audience. He looked as though he had stepped out of another lifetime. His dark suit had faded almost gray. His shoes had been repaired so many times that no original leather remained. A weathered railroad cap rested beneath one arm. Every step required effort. Every breath sounded heavy. Yet his eyes burned with a quiet strength that made even the security guards hesitate. They rushed toward him anyway. "Sir, you can't go on stage." The old man didn't argue. He simply reached into the inside pocket of his coat. The guards instantly stiffened. Several audience members gasped. One security officer grabbed his wrist. Slowly, very slowly, the old man opened his trembling hand. Inside rested nothing more than an old photograph. Its edges had turned yellow with age. Its corners were torn. Its surface was cracked by decades of being carried through rain, heat, and time. The host happened to glance at it. His smile disappeared. He blinked, looked again, His entire face turned pale. Without saying a single word, he gently removed the microphone from the young superstar's hand, walked directly toward the old man, and placed it into his trembling fingers. Confusion swept through the studio. The cameras captured every second. No script mentioned this. No rehearsal had prepared anyone for what was happening. The old man lifted his eyes. He looked only at Elvis, not the audience, not the cameras, only Elvis. For what felt like an eternity, neither man spoke. Then the old man whispered 6 words that shattered the silence forever. "I brought your father's final promise home." Elvis's face lost every trace of color. The microphone slipped from his fingers. It struck the wooden stage with a sharp metallic crack that echoed through the silent studio. He took one slow step backward. His lips trembled. His eyes filled instantly with tears. Because he recognized that voice. And if that voice was real, then everything he had believed for the last quarter of a century had been a lie. The old man slowly reached inside his coat once more. This time, he pulled out a tiny, rusted metal box wrapped in faded leather. He held it toward Elvis with both trembling hands. "I've carried this," his voice cracked, "for 25 years. The studio remained perfectly still. No applause, no whispers, no music. Only silence. And inside that ancient metal box lay a secret powerful enough to change not only Elvis Presley, but every soul watching that unforgettable night. For several endless seconds, no one moved. No one spoke. Even the studio lights seemed colder than before. The tiny rusted metal box rested between the old man's trembling hands and Elvis's shaking fingers, as though time itself refused to decide who should hold it. Finally, Elvis reached forward. The moment his fingertips touched the cold metal, an overwhelming memory crashed into him. He was a little boy again, barefoot, standing beside the railroad tracks outside Tupelo while the evening sun painted the sky orange. His father laughed beside another railroad worker, a tall black man whose deep voice carried old blues melodies farther than the whistle of any passing train. The man would always kneel before young Elvis and grin. "One day you'll sing louder than these trains." Little Elvis had laughed every time. Then, one morning, the man was simply gone. Nobody explained why. His father never spoke about him again. The memory vanished as quickly as it had appeared. Elvis looked into the old man's eyes. "It was really you." The old man smiled through tears. "I wondered if you'd still remember. I searched for you. I know. They told me you were dead. They wanted you to believe that." The audience exchanged confused glances. Millions of viewers leaned closer to their television sets. The young funk superstar folded his arms impatiently. "This has gone far enough," he muttered. "People came here for music." The old man slowly turned toward him. His face carried no anger, only sadness. "You think music begins with a stage?" He paused. "It begins with sacrifice." The studio fell silent again. The old man looked back at Elvis. "Your father asked me to disappear." A wave of disbelief swept across the room. Elvis frowned. "No. He did." "Why?" "Because there were people who wanted something your family could never give. The old man's voice became quieter. Money. The orchestra members stared at one another. No one dared interrupt. The old man gently opened the rusted box. Its hinges groaned after so many silent years. Inside rested 3 objects: a worn guitar pick, a faded black-and-white photograph, and a sealed envelope whose paper had become almost golden with age. The audience could barely breathe. The old man carefully lifted the guitar pick first. "You recognize this?" Elvis nodded immediately. "My first guitar." "No," the old man smiled. "The first guitar your father built." Elvis's eyes widened. "My father built it?" "With his own hands. He told me he bought it." "He lied." The old man's voice broke. "Because he didn't want you carrying the weight of what it cost." The studio remained perfectly still. The old man placed the pick into Elvis's hand. "He sold his wedding ring." Elvis closed his fingers around it.
He worked double shifts. He skipped meals. He borrowed tools he couldn't afford. He built that guitar one piece at a time while you slept.
A tear rolled down Elvis's cheek. "I never knew. He wanted it that way." The old man reached for the faded photograph. He handed it to Elvis. Elvis stared silently. It showed 4 people standing beside an old railroad track: his father, his mother, the old man, and himself. Only 6 years old, holding a homemade guitar nearly as large as his own body. His mother was laughing. His father looked proud. The old man rested one hand on the little boy's shoulder. The picture shook in Elvis's hands. "I've never seen this. Your father never wanted fame to erase where you came from." The old man's eyes drifted toward the audience. "He feared success would one day become a prison." The young funk superstar scoffed. "So what?" "It's an old picture." The old man slowly faced him. "You're still looking at paper." He gently tapped his own chest. "I'm looking at a promise." The room became silent once again. Finally, only the envelope remained. Its seal had never been broken. Across its front, the handwriting was unmistakable. "Open this only on the hardest day of your life." Elvis's breathing became uneven. "My father wrote this." "Yes." "When?" "The night before he sent me away." "Why didn't you bring it sooner?" The old man's eyes filled with regret. "I tried. I came looking for you more than once. I was always too late." He lowered his head. "Managers moved you. Tours moved you. Life moved you. I waited. I believed God would choose the right day." His trembling hand touched the envelope. "When I saw millions laughing at you tonight," his voice cracked, "I knew. This was the day your father had seen long before any of us." Elvis stared at the envelope as though it carried the weight of an entire lifetime. His fingers hovered above the seal, but refused to break it. Fear settled inside his heart. Not fear of what was written, fear of hearing his father's voice again after so many years. The host quietly wiped tears from his eyes. The orchestra remained frozen. Several audience members were already crying. No one cared about the television schedule anymore. The entire country had forgotten they were watching a live entertainment program. This had become something else, something sacred. The young funk superstar suddenly stepped forward. His patience had vanished. "Enough!" His voice echoed across the studio. "It's just an old letter." He pointed directly at Elvis. "Open it, or admit you're afraid." The challenge hung in the air. Elvis slowly raised his eyes. Not with anger, not with pride, with sorrow. He looked at the envelope one final time. Then, very carefully, he slid one trembling finger beneath the fragile seal. The sound of ancient paper tearing echoed through the silent studio like thunder. A single folded letter slipped into his hands. Before Elvis could unfold it, something else fell from inside the envelope. A brittle newspaper clipping drifted gently through the air. It landed face up at the feet of the young funk superstar. He looked down absent-mindedly. Then his expression changed. The smile disappeared. His eyes widened. Because printed across the front page was a headline no one in that room had expected to see. And beneath that headline was a truth powerful enough to rewrite everything the world believed about Elvis Presley's family. The newspaper clipping floated to the polished wooden floor so gently, yet the sound it made seemed louder than every laugh that had filled the studio only minutes before. No one bent down to pick it up. No one dared. The young funk superstar stared at the faded headline beneath his feet. The color drained from his face. His lips parted. But no words came. Elvis slowly knelt and picked up the fragile piece of paper, as though he were lifting something sacred. Its edges were cracked. Its ink had faded after decades. Yet every word remained painfully clear. The headline read, "Unknown railroad worker saves family during hardest winter. Refuses to give his name." Elvis frowned. His hands trembled. He continued reading. The article described a freezing winter in Mississippi, years before anyone outside their hometown had ever heard the name Elvis Presley. His father had lost work. His mother had become dangerously ill. There was almost no food left inside their tiny house. For nearly 3 months, an unknown railroad worker quietly left sacks of flour, milk, vegetables, blankets, and firewood outside their front door before sunrise, every single morning. Never asking for thanks, never leaving his name. Neighbors believed it was a miracle. Even Elvis's parents never discovered who had saved them. Until now. Elvis slowly raised his eyes. He looked at the old man standing before him. "You." The old man smiled softly. "I promised your father he would never owe me anything." A tear escaped Elvis's eye. "You kept us alive." The old man shook his head. "No." He glanced toward the envelope. "Your father did. He refused to surrender. He refused to let his family lose hope. I only helped him keep that promise." The entire studio sat frozen. Many people had forgotten they were breathing. The host quietly removed his glasses. Several camera operators wiped tears from their faces without stopping the broadcast. The young superstar slowly lowered his head. For the first time that evening, he looked small, very small. Elvis finally unfolded the letter. His father's familiar handwriting seemed almost alive. The studio became so silent that the soft rustle of the paper echoed through every corner of the room. Elvis began reading aloud, My dear son, if these words have finally reached your hands, then the day I feared has arrived. One day the crowds will become louder than your own heart. Some will cheer you, others will forget you, and some will laugh while pretending they know who you are. Do not hate them. People who laugh at another person's pain are usually hiding wounds no one else can see. If that day ever comes, do not answer with anger. Do not answer with pride. Answer with the gift God placed inside your soul. Sing, because songs reach places that arguments never will. If your voice can comfort even one broken heart, then every sacrifice your mother and I made will have been worth it. And remember one more thing. The greatest man in your life may never become famous. He may never stand beneath bright lights. He may never receive applause. Sometimes, the greatest man is the one who quietly carries another family through the darkest winter, without expecting anyone to remember his name. If you are reading this, find him, take his hand, and let the world know who the real hero has always been. I have loved you every day of my life. No matter where I am, I always will. Dad. By the time Elvis reached the final word, his voice had become nothing more than a whisper. Tears rolled freely down his face. Across the studio, no one was ashamed of crying anymore. The old man quietly wiped his own eyes. I promised him I'd bring that letter to you only when your heart needed it more than your career. Elvis stepped forward without saying a word. He wrapped both arms around the old railroad worker. The embrace lasted several long seconds. The audience watched in complete silence. Then, Elvis picked up the old guitar pick. He pressed it gently against his lips. After a long breath, he walked toward the grand piano waiting quietly beneath the lights. He sat down. He never announced a song. He never introduced himself. He simply rested his trembling hands above the keys. The first note echoed through the studio, soft, lonely, almost like a prayer whispered into the darkness. The laughter that had filled the room only minutes earlier disappeared forever. The second chord followed, then another. When Elvis finally began to sing, his voice carried no anger, no bitterness, only gratitude. Every lyric sounded less like music and more like a son speaking to parents he hoped could still hear him. One violinist quietly lowered his bow. He could no longer play through the tears. Another musician stopped, then another. Within moments, the entire orchestra had fallen silent. Only Elvis's voice remained, raw, fragile, beautiful. The cameras slowly swept across the audience. The woman who had laughed the loudest covered her face with both hands. A producer inside the control room openly cried. Security guards stood perfectly still, their eyes wet. The host bowed his head. Even millions watching from home found themselves unable to look away. When Elvis reached the final verse, he looked toward the old railroad worker. Every word became a thank you, not only to him, but to every forgotten soul whose kindness had quietly changed another person's life. The final note faded into silence. No one moved. Not a single sound came from the audience. 5 seconds passed. 10. 15. It felt as though the entire world had forgotten how to breathe. Then, A woman in the very last row slowly stood. She placed one trembling hand over her heart without saying a word. Another person stood beside her, then another, 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 like waves rolling toward the shore. The entire audience rose to their feet. No one shouted, no one whistled. They simply stood, clapping through tears. The applause grew louder, longer, stronger, minute after minute. It became more than applause. It became gratitude. The young funk superstar slowly walked across the stage. Gone was the arrogance. Gone was the smile. He stopped in front of Elvis. Without looking toward the cameras, without worrying about his reputation, he placed the microphone on the floor. Then he bowed his head. I thought greatness was measured by applause. His voice shook. Tonight I learned it is measured by character. Elvis gently lifted the young man back to his feet. No one is beyond forgiveness. The young musician broke into tears. The old railroad worker smiled. For the first time that night, peace settled over the stage. Elvis turned toward him. He took the old man's weathered hand with both of his own. His voice was barely above a whisper. Tonight, I didn't just find my father's letter. He smiled through tears. I found the part of him that never stopped walking beside me. The old man's eyes closed for a moment. So did I, son. The cameras slowly pulled away from the stage. No director wanted to interrupt what had become far more than a television performance. It had become a reminder that kindness does not disappear with time, that love can survive decades of silence, and that the strongest people are often the ones history almost forgets. Long after the lights inside the studio were turned off, long after the audience returned home, people continued speaking about that extraordinary night. Not because of a song, not because of a celebrity, but because, for a few unforgettable moments, the entire world watched pride surrender to humility, cruelty surrender to compassion, and a son's broken heart find its way home at last. Years later, those who claimed they had been inside that studio rarely spoke about the music first. They spoke about the silence, because they all remembered the same impossible feeling. For one brief evening, it had felt as though heaven itself had stopped to listen.